On a wet November morning in 1922, a 61-year-old man walked out of a palace on the Bosphorus and stepped into a waiting British ambulance. He was the 36th ruler of a dynasty that had held power for 623 years. By the time the sun went down, that dynasty had no throne, no empire, and no way home. This is the story of how an empire that ruled across 3 continents actually ended, not in one great battle, but in a handful of very quiet rooms. And here's the part almost nobody tells you. The Ottoman Empire did not die on the day the fighting stopped. It didn't die when the peace treaty was signed either. It died in stages, over roughly 16 months, in a sequence so strange that there was a period where the empire had a caliph but no sultan, a government in one city and a parliament in another, and 2 rival capitals arguing about which one of them was actually Turkey. The family at the center of it all was still alive when it happened. That's the part that stays with you. Most empires collapse, and the dynasty dies with them, in a cellar or on a scaffold. This one didn't. The House of Osman walked out of history alive, with suitcases, and then had to figure out how to be ordinary. Some of them ended up in Nice, some in Beirut. One of them ended up above a restaurant in New York City, and one of them, remarkably, ended up in India. We'll get to all of that, but to understand why those final hours felt the way they did, you have to understand what was actually ending. Start with the beginning, because the scale of it is hard to hold in your head. Around the year 1299, in a small frontier town called Soghit in northwestern Anatolia, a chieftain named Osman began carving out territory at the edge of the crumbling Byzantine world. He was one of dozens of minor warlords in the region. There was nothing obviously special about him. His descendants took his name, Oxmant, which Europeans eventually mangled into Ottoman, and over the next 2 centuries they did something none of their rivals managed. They kept expanding, generation after generation, without breaking apart. In 1453, one of those descendants, Mehmed II, did the thing that had been considered impossible for 1,000 years. He took Constantinople. The walls that had held off army after army since the 5th century finally came down, and the city that had been the seat of Roman power in the east became the capital of a Turkish Muslim empire. That single event reordered the map of the world. It's part of why European sailors started looking for sea routes to Asia. It's part of why the Renaissance accelerated, as Greek scholars scattered west with their libraries. One city changed hands, and the consequences ran for centuries. Then in 1517, Sultan Selim I conquered Egypt and Syria, and with them came something even bigger than territory. The Ottoman sultans began to claim the title of caliph, the successor to leadership, over the Muslim community. This matters enormously for the ending of this story, so hold on to it. It meant the man in Constantinople wasn't just a king. In the eyes of millions of people who had never set foot in his empire, he was a religious authority. That claim would outlive the empire itself by exactly 16 months. Remember that. The peak came under Salim's son, Suleiman, the one Europe called the Magnificent, who ruled from 1520 to 1566. At its height, the empire stretched across 3 continents: southeastern Europe, Western Asia, and North Africa. It controlled the Balkans, most of the Middle East, the coast of North Africa, the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, and the shipping lanes of the eastern Mediterranean. Its capital was one of the largest cities on earth. Its navy contested the entire Mediterranean. Vienna sat awake at night thinking about it. And then, slowly, over 3 centuries, it stopped growing. That's the crucial thing to understand about Ottoman decline. It wasn't a crash. It was a slow, grinding loss of ground that lasted longer than most countries have existed. The second failed siege of Vienna in 1683 is usually marked as the turning point, the moment the tide stopped coming in and started going out. After that came a long sequence of wars with Russia, with Austria, with rebellious provinces. Greece broke away in the 1820s and 30s. Egypt drifted into effective independence. In the 19th century, European diplomats started using a nickname for the empire that tells you everything about how it was seen: the sick man of Europe. The phrase is generally attributed to Tsar Nicholas I of Russia, and the point of it was blunt. The patient is dying. The only question is who inherits the estate. The Ottomans knew this. That's the thing people miss. They weren't oblivious. Through the 1800s, they launched wave after wave of reform: new law codes, new schools, a modernized army, a constitution in 1876, telegraph lines, railways, a reorganized bureaucracy. Some of it worked. None of it worked fast enough. Reform costs money, and reform in an empire that's losing its richest provinces means borrowing money, and borrowing money from European banks meant that by 1881 European creditors had effectively taken control of a chunk of Ottoman revenue collection. The empire was spending its future to buy time in the present. By 1908, a movement of young officers and reformers forced the Sultan, Abdul Hamid II, to restore the constitution. A year later, they deposed him outright. Then came the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913, and in a matter of months, the empire lost almost everything it still held in Europe, territory it had ruled for 500 years, gone in 2 campaigning seasons. Hundreds of thousands of refugees streamed toward Constantinople. If you want to know what the mood in the capital was on the eve of the First World War, that's it. Not confidence, grief and fury and a desperate sense that something drastic had to be done. So in late 1914, the empire entered the First World War on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary. It was, in hindsight, the decision that ended everything. But at the time, the logic was survival. Pick a strong partner, win, and claw back the losses. They didn't win, but they also didn't simply collapse, and this is where the story gets genuinely complicated. Ottoman forces fought for 4 years across an enormous front. At Gallipoli in 1915 and 1916, they held off a massive Allied naval and land campaign and forced a withdrawal. It was one of the most significant defensive victories of the entire war. And it produced a name you need to remember, because he becomes the second half of this story, a divisional commander named Mustafa Kemal, who came out of Gallipoli, a national hero. The war years were also, and there's no way around this, the period of the Armenian genocide, the mass deportation and killing of Armenian civilians beginning in 1915, in which well over 1 million people died. It's recognized as genocide by many governments and by the great majority of genocide scholars, and it remains contested by the Turkish state. It is not a footnote to this story. It's part of what the empire was doing in the years it was dying, and any honest account of the end has to say so. By 1918, the position was hopeless. Allied forces had taken Baghdad, Jerusalem, and Damascus. The Arab revolt had stripped away the empire's southern provinces. Bulgaria dropped out of the war, which severed the land link to Germany. In July of that year, the Sultan Mehmed Veth died. His half-brother came to the throne as Mehmed VI, known by his given name Vahidid, and he inherited a crown at the exact moment it became worthless. On the 30th of October 1918, Ottoman representatives signed an armistice aboard a British battleship, HMS Agamemnon, anchored off the island of Lemnos. It's known as the Armistice of Mudros. The terms were not a ceasefire between equals. They opened the straits to Allied fleets, demobilized the Ottoman army, and, this is the clause that mattered, gave the Allies the right to occupy any territory in the event of disorder. That clause was a blank check, and everybody signing knew it. 2 weeks later, on the 13th of November, an Allied fleet dropped anchor in front of the imperial capital. British, French, Italian, and Greek warships sitting in the Bosphorus in view of the palace windows. Occupying troops came ashore. The city that had not been taken by a foreign army since 1453 was now under foreign control, and the Sultan was, in every meaningful sense, a prisoner in his own capital. Now, put yourself in Vahidin's position, because his choices in the next 4 years get judged harshly, and they were genuinely impossible. His army was disbanded, his capital was occupied, his treasury was empty, foreign commanders could remove his ministers. He calculated, and this is the calculation the rest of his life would be defined by, that the only way to preserve anything at all was to cooperate with the occupiers and hope for lenient terms. Play nice, keep the throne, salvage a rump state. Somebody else made a different calculation. On the 15th of May, 1919, Greek troops landed at Smyrna on the Aegean coast with Allied backing and began occupying the surrounding region. The reaction inside Anatolia was volcanic. 4 days later, on the 19th of May, Mustafa Kemal landed at the Black Sea port of Samsun. He had been sent there by the Sultan's own government on an official inspection assignment to help wind down and disarm the remaining army units. He did the opposite. He began organizing them. Over the next year, a resistance movement assembled itself in the Anatolian interior, far from the occupied capital, held congresses, drew up a national program, and started functioning like a government. On the 23rd of April, 1920, a grand National Assembly opened in Ankara, a dusty provincial town chosen precisely because it was hard to reach and easy to defend. From that day forward, there were 2 Turkish governments, one in Constantinople, under a sultan surrounded by foreign troops, one in Ankara, under a general with an army. Both claimed to speak for the same people. And here's the moment the empire's fate was really sealed, though it looked at the time like the opposite. On the 10th of August, 1920, the Sultan's government signed the Treaty of Sèvres. If you have never read what was in that treaty, it is genuinely staggering. It partitioned Anatolia itself. Zones of French and Italian influence in the south, Greek administration around Smyrna with a referendum to follow, an independent Armenia in the east. Provision for Kurdish autonomy, the straits placed under international control, the Ottoman army capped at a token force, foreign financial supervision over the state budget. What was left for the Sultan was a strip of territory in central and northern Anatolia and a capital city he did not control. Ankara refused it, flatly, immediately, absolutely. And in that refusal, the resistance movement won the argument that would decide everything, because now the choice in front of ordinary people was no longer Sultan versus general. It was a treaty that erased the country versus a movement that promised to fight it. The Grand National Assembly declared the treaty void, and everyone who signed it a traitor. Sèvres was never ratified. It never came into force. But it did something more important than that. It made the Sultan look like the man who had signed away the homeland. The war that followed ran for 3 years, and it was brutal. Greek forces pushed deep into Anatolia and got within striking distance of Ankara. In August and September of 1921, at the Sakarya River, the Turkish nationalists held them in a battle that lasted 3 weeks. Then a year of rebuilding. Then, in August of 1922, the counter-offensive which broke the Greek army at Dumlupanar and rolled it back to the coast. On the 9th of September 1922, Turkish troops entered Smyrna. Days later, a catastrophic fire destroyed much of the city, killing an unknown number of people and driving a huge civilian population onto the waterfront and onto evacuation ships. The cause of the fire is still argued about a century later. What isn't argued about is that a great multi-ethnic port city effectively ceased to exist in a week. On the 11th of October 1922, an armistice was signed at Mudanya. The fighting was over. The Allies accepted that the Ankara government now controlled Anatolia and would be the party they negotiated with, which left one question: what do you do with the Sultan? The Allies had an idea, and it was a spectacularly bad one. They invited both governments to the coming peace conference at Lausanne, both. The Sultan's delegation and Ankara's delegation sitting at the same table, on the same side, representing the same nation. Mustafa Kemal's answer to that invitation was to remove the problem entirely. On the 1st of November 1922, the Grand National Assembly in Ankara passed a resolution abolishing the Ottoman Sultanate. The wording did something clever, and this is the hinge of the whole story. It separated two things that had been fused since 1517. The Sultanate, the political office, the throne, the temporal power, was abolished, declared to have ended with the Allied occupation of the capital. But the caliphate, the religious office, was kept. The assembly would simply choose which member of the House of Osman held it. So on the 1st of November, Vahiduddin stopped being a sultan. He was, in theory, still caliph for a few more days. Then the assembly moved to strip him of that too. Which brings us back to that wet morning. Vahiduddin understood exactly what was coming. In the capital, the crowds were celebrating Ankara's victory. Nationalist officers were arriving in the city. He had been declared a traitor by the winning side, and there was no court, no army, and no faction left to protect him. He asked the British commander in the city, General Charles Harrington, for asylum. On the 17th of November 1922, in the early hours, he left Yildiz Palace with a small group, a few of his household, one of his sons, personal servants, and whatever he could carry. Accounts of that morning consistently describe rain. British soldiers escorted him. He was driven in a British military ambulance down to the water, put aboard a launch, and taken out to the battleship HMS Malaya. Think about the arithmetic of that for a second. 6 centuries and 23 years, 36 sultans. An empire that at various points held Athens, Cairo, Baghdad, Damascus, Jerusalem, Mecca, Belgrade, Budapest, Algiers, and it ends with one elderly man, in the rain, on a foreign warship, leaving a city his ancestor took by storm in 1453. He never saw it again. Now, the empire had ended, but the dynasty hadn't, and the next 16 months are the strangest interval in the whole story. The day after Vahiduddin sailed, on the 18th of November, 1922, the Grand National Assembly elected his cousin as caliph. His name was Abdulmejid II. He was a painter. Genuinely, seriously, that was his life's work. He'd trained in the imperial tradition, painted in a European style, collected art, played music, and had spent his life as a cultured prince with no expectation of ruling anything. He was given a religious title with no state attached to it, told he could not use political power, could not call himself sultan, and would perform ceremonial and spiritual functions on behalf of a republic that hadn't formally been declared yet. It was a title stripped of everything except its meaning, and that turned out to be the problem, because the meaning was enormous. Over the following months, the caliph in Constantinople began attracting exactly the thing Ankara feared. Muslims outside Turkey, particularly in India, where a mass movement had campaigned for years to preserve the caliphate, wrote letters, sent money, and made appeals. Prominent Indian Muslim leaders publicly urged that the office be maintained with dignity. Inside Turkey, opponents of the new order started gathering around the idea of the caliphate as a counterweight. Foreign journalists were requesting audiences. A man with no army and no treasury was becoming a rival center of gravity simply by existing. Meanwhile, the republic was being built at speed. On the 24th of July, 1923, the Treaty of Lausanne was signed. The treaty that replaced Sèvres recognized the borders of the new Turkish state and remains the legal foundation of modern Turkey. On the 13th of October, Ankara was made the capital. And on the 29th of October, 1923, the Republic of Turkey was proclaimed with Mustafa Kemal as its first president, which left one loose thread: a palace in the old capital with a caliph in it. On the 3rd of March, 1924, the Grand National Assembly abolished the caliphate, and this time they did not stop at the office. The same day's legislation expelled every member of the House of Osman from the territory of the Republic. Not the head of the family, not the claimants, everyone. Men, women, children, in-laws by marriage into the dynasty, around 150 people. Their titles were void, their property was taken by the state, their passports were stamped for one-way departure, and the law set the term of exile as permanent. Abdulmajid was informed at night. He was given a short window to prepare, escorted to a railway station outside the city at Chatalka to avoid crowds, and put on a train, the Orient Express, with his family, a small amount of foreign currency, and some personal belongings. That's it. That is the actual, literal end of the House of Osman as a ruling family, a train pulling out of a suburban station before dawn. Over the following days and weeks, the rest of the family followed, in ones and twos, from ports and stations across the country. Some had a few hours' notice. Some carried jewelry sewn into clothing. Most had never lived outside the empire and spoke French as their second language, which shaped where they went. The dynasty scattered across Europe, the Levant and Egypt, and effectively ceased to be a single thing. So where did they actually go? Because this is the part the history books usually compress into one sentence, and it's the most human part of the whole story. Vahid-ed-Din, the last sultan, went from Malta to San Remo on the Italian Riviera. He lived there in reduced circumstances, kept a small household, and never renounced his position. He died on the 16th of May, 1926, at 64. And then came the detail that says everything about how far the family had fallen. According to widely repeated contemporary accounts, his creditors moved to seize his coffin over unpaid debts, and the burial was held up while the situation was resolved. He was eventually taken to Damascus and buried in the courtyard of the Sultan Selim Mosque complex, named for the very ancestor whose conquest had given his family the caliphate 400 years earlier. He was not permitted to be buried in the city his family had ruled for 5 centuries. Abdulmajid, the last caliph, settled in Switzerland, then in Nice on the French Riviera. He kept painting. He kept a modest court of loyalists. He arranged marriages for his daughter and his relatives to other Muslim royal houses, which was the family's one remaining asset, prestige. When the Second World War came, he was living in Paris. He died there on the 23rd of August, 1944, aged 70-something. He was born in 1868, so 76, at the very moment the city was being liberated. Turkey would not take his body. He lay in Paris for a decade before finally being buried in Medina, in Saudi Arabia, in 1954. And here's where the story goes, somewhere you would never predict. Abdulmajid's only daughter was named Durashevar. She was born in 1914 in the imperial capital, and she was 10 years old when her family was put on that train. In 1931, at 17, she married Azam Jah, the eldest son and heir of the Nizam of Hyderabad, at that time reputed to be one of the wealthiest men in the world. Her cousin Nilüfer married the Nizam's second son. 2 Ottoman princesses, raised in palaces on the Bosphorus, exiled as children, married into an Indian princely house. Durashevar became a genuinely significant public figure in Hyderabad. She pushed for women's education and health care, and a children's and general hospital in the city carries her name to this day. Her marriage eventually broke down, and after Indian independence and the end of the princely states, she spent much of her later life in London, where she died in 2006, aged 91. A woman born as an Ottoman imperial princess who spent her middle years in India and died in a London hospital in the 21st century. That's the range this family covers. Then there's Nesliha. Born in 1921, she has the distinction of being the last person entered in the imperial register as a princess of the House of Osman before the register stopped existing. She was 3 years old when the family was expelled. She was also, through her parents, a granddaughter of both the last sultan and the last caliph, the 2 branches of the story, joined in one child. She grew up in exile in Europe and Egypt, and in 1940 she married an Egyptian prince, Abdelmonem. In 1952, when the Egyptian monarchy was overthrown, her husband was appointed to the Regency Council for the infant king, so a woman exiled from one collapsing empire found herself, briefly, at the very top of another monarchy that was itself in the process of ending. Within a couple of years that was over too, and the family faced arrest and confiscation in Egypt before eventually being allowed to leave. She finally returned to Istanbul, lived there for decades, and died in 2012 at 91. And then there's the one that gets me every time. Ertuğrul Osman was born in 1912 in a palace in Istanbul, a grandson of Sultan Abdülhamid II. He was 12, away at school in Vienna, when the exile order came, and he simply never went home. He studied in Europe, worked in the mining business, and eventually settled in New York City. For more than half a century, he lived in a walk-up apartment above a restaurant in Manhattan. Neighbors knew him as a quiet, courteous, elderly gentleman with an accent. Many had no idea that had history gone differently, he would have been addressed as His Imperial Highness, and would have become head of a 600-year-old dynasty, which in fact he did become in 1994 in that apartment. In 1992, aged 80, he was invited to visit Turkey. He'd been away 68 years. He went to Dolmabahce Palace, the palace where his grandfather had lived, one of the buildings his family had built, and he joined the public tour. He walked through the staterooms with a ticket, like a tourist. He later said, in interviews, that he preferred it that way, and he said something else that gets quoted often and deserves to be, that democracy works well in Turkey. He had no interest in a restoration. Turkey granted him citizenship in 2004, 80 years after his family was stripped of it. He died in Istanbul in 2009, aged 97, and was buried in the mausoleum of Sultan Mahmud II in the Old City among his ancestors. The last member of the family who had actually been born in the Ottoman Empire, in an Ottoman palace, came home at the end. So where is the House of Osman today? It still exists, and it's larger than most people assume. The exile laws were gradually lifted. Women of the dynasty were permitted to return from 1952, and men from 1974, half a century after they were expelled. Descendants live in Turkey, across Europe, in the United States, and in the Middle East. In 1934, when Turkey introduced a surname law, the family took the name Osmanoglu, meaning son of Osman, which is what they go by now. Headship of the house passes not by father to son, but by agnatic seniority to the eldest surviving male of the line. Ertugrul Osman was the 43rd head. Since 2021, the head of the house has been Harun Osman Osmanoglu, born in Damascus in 1932 to a family that had fled there in the exile, a great-grandson of Abdülhamid II. He returned to Turkey in the 1970s and lives in Istanbul. They are private citizens. Some appear at cultural events, publish family histories, or give the occasional interview. None of them has any legal claim, and by their own repeated statements, none of them is seeking one. But the empire left more behind than a family. Look at a map of the modern Middle East and you are looking at the Ottoman collapse. The borders of Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Israel, and the Palestinian territories, the Gulf states, nearly all of them were drawn or fixed in the decades around that ending by mandate authorities and post-war agreements dividing former Ottoman provinces. A very large share of the conflicts that dominate the news today runs directly back to how those lines were drawn on top of provinces that had been administered a completely different way for 400 years. And there's a quieter piece of evidence that the empire took a long time to fully die. The Ottoman public debt, the money borrowed in the 19th century to fund the reforms that were supposed to save the empire, didn't vanish when the empire did. Under the Lausanne settlement, it was divided among the successor states. The Republic of Turkey went on paying its share, installment after installment, for 3 decades. The final payment was made in 1954. 32 years after the Sultanate was abolished, 30 years after the family was put on trains, the Turkish state was still writing checks against loans taken out by sultans who had been dead for generations. An empire can be legislated out of existence in an afternoon. Its debts take a lifetime. The buildings survive too. Topkapi Palace, where sultans ruled for nearly 4 centuries, was opened as a museum in 1924, the same year the family was expelled, and today it holds millions of visitors a year filing past the rooms where those decisions were made. Dolmabahce, the great 19th century palace on the water, is a museum as well, and in one of its bedrooms, a clock is kept stopped at 9:05, the hour Mustafa Kemal Ataturk died there in 1938 in a palace built by the dynasty he replaced. The man who ended the empire died in the empire's own house. That's the thing about the final hours of the Ottoman Empire. There was no last stand, no burning throne room. The end was a signature on a ship, a vote in a provincial assembly, an ambulance in the rain, and a night train leaving a suburban station. 600 years of history closed with paperwork, but the people didn't end. They dispersed, and they adapted, and they became painters and businessmen and doctors' patrons and quiet neighbors in Manhattan apartments, and their descendants are alive right now, walking around a country that no longer remembers to look at them twice, which may be the strangest ending an empire has ever had. Not extinction, and not restoration, but something in between, ordinary life.